Welcome to Mamahood After Trauma, where we stop pretending and heal out loud. I'm Emily Cleghorn, trauma survivor, cycle breaker, and mama rebuilding from the inside out. If you're ready to break cycles, trust yourself again, and rise without shame, you're in the right place. Let's go. Before we dive in, mama, if you're a mama healing from trauma and trying to parent differently, but you're not sure what support or next step is right for you, I totally understand. And that's why I've created something to help. Take my free Find Your Next Step to Calm and Healing quiz to discover where you are in your healing journey and what your next best step looks like. You'll find the link in the show notes below. Hey, mama. Welcome to the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. I'm Emily, and this is the podcast where we talk about what it actually looks like to heal from trauma while also raising children, navigating relationships, and trying to build a life that feels safer than the one we came from. In our last episode, where you and I had a conversation, we talked about what happens when your body forces you to slow down. If you missed that episode, feel free to listen to this one and then go back if you'd like. And I shared some of my own experience with realizing that I can't just keep pushing forever. That eventually our bodies start sending us messages. Sometimes those messages are subtle, and sometimes they're loud. And then sometimes our bodies force us to confront the fact that the way we're living just flat out isn't sustainable. But here's the thing. Once you realize you're overwhelmed, once you realize you're exhausted, once you realize you're constantly giving from empty, you eventually have to ask yourself, okay, so what do I do about it? And one of the answers to that question is boundaries, which sounds really simple. But for many of us trauma survivors, boundaries are anything but simple. Because if you grew up believing that your needs were inconvenient, if you learned that saying no led to conflict, if you learned that keeping people happy was the safest option, if you learned that love was conditional, then boundaries don't necessarily feel like protection. They can feel like danger. They can feel like rejection. They can feel a whole lot of selfish. They can feel mean. And they can feel terrifying. So that's what I want to talk about today. Because I truly believe that boundaries aren't mean. They're medicine. And sometimes the most healing thing we can do is finally give ourselves permission to stop doing things that are hurting us. So let's talk about it. Let's start here. Why are boundaries so hard? Why can something as simple as saying, no, I can't do that, feel like you're committing a crime? Why do some of us rehearse a text message for 30 minutes before sending it? Why do some of us explain ourselves until we're blue in the face? Why do we apologize when we haven't done anything wrong? Why do we add 17 reasons for why we can't do the thing? And then we still feel guilty. Why? Why? Because for many of us, the problem isn't that we don't know what a boundary is. The problem is that our nervous system has learned that boundaries are dangerous. Maybe you grew up in a home where saying no wasn't allowed. Maybe your parents' moods determined the emotional climate of the entire household. Maybe you had to anticipate what other people needed. Maybe you had to learn to be agreeable. Maybe you learned that conflict meant danger. Maybe you were punished for having an opinion. Maybe you were called selfish when you tried to advocate for yourself. Maybe you were made responsible for someone else's feelings. And so you learned, if I keep everyone else happy, I'm safe. Mama, that's people pleasing. And people pleasing isn't just being nice. It's a survival strategy. It's your nervous system trying to manage the environment around you so that you can feel safe inside of it. So when you start setting boundaries, your nervous system might not immediately go, wonderful, healthy choice. It might actually say, oh my goodness, we're in danger. You say no, and suddenly your heart is racing and it feels like it's in your throat. You feel anxious. You start second guessing yourself. You want to send another message. You want to explain it. You want to take it back. You want to make sure they're not going to be mad at you. And that's the moment where we need to remember that feeling guilty doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. Sometimes guilt is just the feeling of doing something unfamiliar. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about boundaries is that people think boundaries are about controlling someone else's behavior. They aren't. They aren't. They aren't. A boundary is not, you can't talk to me like that. That's actually a demand. A boundary sounds more like, if you speak to me that way, I will end the conversation. Do you see the difference? One is about controlling another person. The other is about deciding what you will do. And that's a really important distinction because we cannot control other people's behavior. We can't control whether someone respects our boundary. We can't control whether they get mad at us or not. We can't control whether or not they understand. We can't control whether or not they agree. And honestly, we can't control whether or not they like it. But we can decide what we are willing to participate in. That's where our power is. And that's where boundaries become medicine. Because instead of constantly trying to manage someone else, we start managing our own participation. We stop asking, how do I get them to behave differently? And we start asking, what do I need to do to take care of myself? That, my friend, is a completely different question. So I mentioned guilt. Let's talk about that because I think it's really, really important. And I think it's where so many trauma survivors get stuck. You set a boundary and then you feel terrible. You think, maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I should have just done it. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe they really do need me. Maybe I'm overreacting. And suddenly, you are the one who is uncomfortable. So you assume you did the wrong thing. But here's what I want you to know. Discomfort is not the same thing as danger. And guilt is not always a moral compass. Sometimes guilt is a trauma response. Sometimes guilt is what happens when you stop doing what you've always done. If you've spent your entire life saying yes, your first no is probably going to feel uncomfortable. If you spent your entire life over-explaining yourself, your first simple no might feel rude. If you have spent your entire life managing other people's emotions, the first time someone gets upset with your boundary might feel absolutely unbearable. But their discomfort doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Their disappointment doesn't automatically mean you've hurt them. Their reaction is not necessarily your responsibility. That's a hard one, especially if you're a mama, because we're constantly taught to be responsible for everyone. Our children, our partners, our parents, our friends, our workplaces, our communities, and somewhere along the way, you can lose yourself entirely. Now, I want to make something really, really clear because I don't want you to hear me say set boundaries and think, okay, so I need to cut everyone off and never let anyone need me again. That is not what I'm saying. Boundaries do not equal walls. Boundaries aren't walls. Okay. We're not building another brick wall here. Walls say nobody gets in. Okay. Boundaries, on the other hand, say you can come in, but this is what I need to feel safe. Walls are about complete disconnection. Boundaries are about creating healthier connection. And sometimes, yes, a boundary might mean creating distance. Sometimes it might mean ending a relationship. Sometimes it might mean going no or low contact. But not every boundary is that dramatic. Sometimes a boundary is, I can't talk about this right now. I'll call you tomorrow. I'm not available this weekend. I'm not comfortable discussing that. Please don't speak to me that way. I need some time to think before I answer. I can't take that on. I'm not able to help with that. That's it. No dissertation, no 20-minute explanation, no courtroom defense, just information. And here's the thing. You're allowed to have limits. You're a human being, not a resource, not an emotional support animal, not a 24-hour crisis hotline, not an unlimited supply of energy. You, my sweet mama friend, have limits. And having limits doesn't make you difficult. It makes you human. One of the most powerful things about boundaries is that they teach us to trust ourselves. Think about this. Every time you recognize a need and you respond to it, you're telling yourself, I matter. Every time you notice you're overwhelmed and you say no, you're telling yourself, my capacity matters. Every time someone crosses a line and you choose to step away, you're telling yourself, I will protect you. That's powerful because so many trauma survivors learned the opposite. We learned your feelings don't matter. Your needs don't matter. Your comfort doesn't matter. Just keep the peace. Don't make waves. Don't upset anyone. Don't be difficult. And boundaries begin to rewrite that story. They say, actually, I matter too. Not more than everyone else, but not less. Too. And I think that's a really important distinction. Important boundaries aren't about becoming selfish. They're about including yourself in the equation. Now, I want to spend some time and talk specifically about motherhood for a minute. Because motherhood can make boundaries incredibly complicated. We're responsible for tiny little humans. They need us. They depend on us. They don't care if we're tired. They don't care if we've had a hard day. They still need dinner. They still need clean clothes. They still need help with their homework. They still need us to regulate alongside of them. And when you're a trauma surviving mama, this can become even more complicated because you're trying to give your children what you didn't have. You're trying to be present. You're trying to be gentle. You're trying to break cycles. You're trying to respond instead of react. And sometimes you can take that desire to break the cycle and turn it into another way of abandoning yourself. You think, I can't say no because I don't want to traumatize my child. I can't have needs because my kids need me. I can't take a break because I'm their mom. But, mama, your child, your children don't need you to have no boundaries. They need you to model them. Because one of the greatest gifts you can give your child is the experience of watching a healthy adult say, I'm tired, so I need to rest. I don't like that. I need some space. I made a mistake. I need help. I'm not available right now. And here's the really beautiful part of that. When we learn boundaries, we're not just changing our own lives. We're teaching our children that they are allowed to have boundaries too. That they can say no. That they can have limits. That they don't have to earn love by abandoning themselves. That, my sweet, sweet mama friend, is cycle breaking. Okay, so let's get practical now. Because sometimes we understand the concept, but when it comes time to actually say the words, our brains turn into jelly and go completely blank. So here are some simple boundaries that I give you permission to borrow. I don't have capacity for that right now. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I need some time to think about it. No, thank you. I'm going to pass. I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want to discuss that. I'll let you know when I'm ready. I can't take that on. And here's my favorite. No. Period. The end. No. That's it. You don't always need a reason. And I know that one can feel incredibly uncomfortable because your brain immediately wants to add, sorry, I would, but unfortunately, I feel terrible, but. And sometimes context is appropriate. Of course, we don't need to become robots. But there's a difference between offering context because you want to and explaining yourself because you're afraid your no won't be accepted. That's the difference I want you to notice. Here's something I've had to remind myself of over and over again. You don't need someone else to agree with you for your boundary to be valid. Hear that again. You don't need someone else to agree with your boundary for it to be valid. You don't need permission. You don't need consensus. You don't need an unanimous vote. You don't need someone else to say, yes, that's a very reasonable boundary. You are allowed to have a limit because you have a limit. Period. The end. End of story. And sometimes people will understand. Sometimes they'll respect it. Sometimes they'll be disappointed. Sometimes they'll be angry. Sometimes they'll tell you that you've changed. And you know what? Maybe you have. Maybe you have changed. Maybe you're no longer willing to be the person who constantly sacrifices herself to keep everyone else comfortable. Maybe you're no longer willing to participate in relationships where your needs don't matter. Maybe you're no longer willing to keep saying yes when your entire body is screaming no. Maybe you are changing, and maybe that's the point. I called this episode Why Boundaries Aren't Mean, They're Medicine. And I mean that because boundaries can be uncomfortable medicine. Sometimes medicine tastes terrible. Sometimes it stings. Sometimes it makes things worse before they get better. And sometimes boundaries will disrupt relationships that were built on your lack of them. That's important because when you start setting boundaries, not everyone will celebrate. Some people have benefited from you having none. Some people have benefited from your constant availability. Some people have benefited from your inability to say no. Some people have benefited from you carrying more than your share. And when you stop, chances are they're not going to like it. But their discomfort isn't proof that your boundary is wrong. Sometimes it's proof that the old dynamic no longer works. And that's okay. Because you're not here to make everyone comfortable. You're here to live a life where you can actually breathe. So here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to notice where you're feeling resentment. Because resentment can be a really useful clue. Not always, but often, resentment can be your nervous system saying, I'm giving more than I actually want to give. So, a simple question you can ask yourself could be, where am I saying yes when I really mean no? Where am I doing something because I feel obligated? Where am I taking responsibility for someone else's emotions? Where am I over-explaining? Where am I apologizing for having needs? And then choose one. Just one. And practice a boundary. It doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't have to blow up your entire life. Maybe you simply say, I can't do that this week. Maybe you stop answering messages immediately. Maybe you tell someone you'll get back to them tomorrow. Maybe you don't volunteer for something. Maybe you let someone be disappointed. And then notice what happens inside of you. Notice the guilt. Notice the anxiety. Notice the urge to take it back. And instead of assuming that feeling means you've done something wrong, try saying, this feels uncomfortable because it's new. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Mama, your boundaries are not a punishment. They're not a weapon. They're not proof that you don't care. They're not you being selfish. They're not mean. They are a way of saying, I care about myself enough to be honest about what I can and cannot give. And that honesty is a gift. Because when you stop saying yes to everything, the yeses you do give become more authentic. When you stop giving from resentment, you can give from genuine willingness. When you stop abandoning yourself, you become more available for the relationships that actually matter. And when you stop teaching your children that love means self-sacrifice, you give them something better. You show them what it looks like to love someone without losing yourself. That's the kind of healing I want. Not walls, not isolation, not disconnection, but relationships where we can be fully human, where we can have needs, where we can have limits, where we can say no, where we can disappoint people, where we can be loved anyway. So if you needed permission today, here it is. You are allowed to have boundaries. You're allowed to have limits. You're allowed to protect your energy. You're allowed to say no. And you're allowed to let someone else be disappointed without rushing in to make them feel better. You don't have to abandon yourself to prove that you love someone. And maybe, just maybe, the boundary you've been afraid to set isn't going to destroy your relationships. Maybe it's going to reveal which relationships were actually healthy enough to hold the real you. Well, Mama, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, I would really appreciate it if you share it with another mama who needs to hear that boundaries aren't selfish. And if you're ready to start understanding your triggers, regulating your nervous system, and breaking the patterns that keep you stuck in survival mode, you'll find resources and supports linked in the show notes. Next week, we're going to take this conversation a little bit deeper. Because what happens when you're always the strong one? What happens when everyone knows they can count on you, but you don't know who you can count on? We're going to talk about energetic overdraft. The hidden piece of constantly giving, carrying, fixing, and holding everything together. Until then, Mama, remember, you don't have to abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. You matter. Your limits matter. And your no is allowed to be a complete sentence. Until next time, Mama, mend the past so you can mama in peace. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Be sure to follow the podcast so new episodes land right in your feed each week. And if you're wondering what your next step toward calmer, more confident motherhood looks like, take my free Find Your Next Step to Calm and Confidence quiz found in the show notes below. Until next time, Mama, mend the past so you can mama in peace.